He was the most brutal, ruthless and barbaric king to have ever reigned over England. 2 of his wives inside of the Tower of London were executed, losing their heads as the executioners struck them clean off their shoulders with a sword and an axe. Henry VIII had many enemies. His friends even became his enemies, and for those people across the kingdom that he reigned over, for some reason he was loved. 70,000 people were executed inside of Henry VIII's nation, roughly 3% of the entire population, meaning that every person must have known someone who lost their lives via the axe, gallows, or other disturbing way. But if I told you that years after the infamous king's death, that his bones were removed from his coffin, you probably would not believe me. Of course, who would want to take the bones of Henry VIII? Well, one man tried his best to steal them, and you would not believe the plans that he had for them. Henry VIII died on the 28th of January 1547 in somewhat of a strange way compared to how he reigned over his country. There was peace for once inside of his chambers, and the grotesque king slipped away surrounded by the Archbishop of Canterbury, his close friend Thomas Cranmer. Cranmer had been fetched, and he raced on horse at breakneck speed to the king's side, and he managed to reach him just before the very end. After Henry's death, there was a great deal of panic. How on earth could the death of such a powerful monarch be told to the public, especially as his successor, his son, Edward VI, was just a boy? England was going from this tyrant king, Henry, to a boy who had no experience. To prepare Henry's body for burial, the royal doctors were called into his chambers, and they began a process which today we would consider disturbing and downright illegal. Embalming the king was vital for the preservation of his remains. The bodies of kings and queens for centuries had been desecrated for this purpose, as doctors made a large incision in the chest of the monarch with a knife, and then hacked out the vital organs, which were then placed inside of other vessels to be buried away from the body. It's hard to imagine today that this was the case, but Henry's body was then wrapped in a thick wax-coated cloth to prevent decay, and his body was then ready for the funeral. Henry VIII had insisted that he was to be buried with his third wife, Jane Seymour, inside of a specially built burial vault under the choir of St George's Chapel in Windsor. This was one of the grandest churches across the nation, and still today is home to the Order of the Garter. The funeral procession for Henry was so big that the streets of Windsor had to be widened to allow for everything to pass by, and sat on top of the king's coffin was a striking lifelike effigy of him, dressed in his finest clothes and wearing a hat encrusted with the finest jewels. For many of the people that day in Windsor, this was the first time they had ever seen an image of the very man who reigned over them for decades. The night before, there was a rumour that the king's body even exploded, as whilst it was resting in Sion Abbey, a huge crack was heard, and various putrid liquids apparently leaked out from the bottom of the huge oak coffin. This explosion could have been caused by the movement of the body as it travelled over the cobbled streets, but the funeral of King Henry VIII went by seamlessly and without any real problems. The king's coffin was lowered into the burial vault, and he was reunited in the vault with his queen, Jane Seymour, who had tragically died years earlier following the birth of their son. But over the years, there were a number of times that this vault was disturbed, mostly to bury the remains of others. The most high-profile person buried alongside Henry VIII was the executed King Charles I, and builders even had to move Henry's huge coffin to the side to get Charles I in. But when the tomb was opened in 1649, it was noticed that the coffin of Henry VIII was in a very bad way and was broken into many different pieces. Now, in fact, the outer wooden coffin was completely shattered, and the inner lead-lined coffin looked as though someone had battered it, as it was covered in damage. Even the trestle that the coffin was placed on was damaged, and with this you could actually see inside of the coffin and look at the remains of the infamous Tudor king. It was said that Henry VIII's skeleton was visible, and on his skull there were still traces of his hair and his beard, despite the fact the remains had been exposed to the air for a good while. But then, one opportunist, years after Henry VIII's death had taken place, tried to steal some of the king's remains and bones. Today it's believed that his remains may still be exposed to the air, as there are no records that exist that claim Henry's coffin was repaired, or that he was placed inside of a new one. But the man who tried to steal Henry's bones was a foot soldier, and he was dispatched inside of Windsor Castle's chapel to work. This shocking incident was recorded, and this man tried to steal the bones of Henry VIII so that he could make a weapon with part of the Tudor king's remains. Witnesses at the time were disgusted when the foot soldier was apprehended near to the burial vault, and he handed over Henry VIII's bones to then be placed back into the coffin. The very bones that he had taken from the king's somewhat damaged coffin just moments before. It was claimed in one account that the sexton did his best to clear the chapel. Nevertheless, Isaac, the sexton's man, said that a foot soldier had hid himself, so as he was not discerned, and being greedy of prey, crept into the vault and cut so much of the velvet pall that covered the great body as he judged would hardly be missed, and wimpled also a hole through the said coffin that was largest, probably fancying that there was something well worth his adventure. The section at his opening the door espied the sacrilegious person, who being searched, a bone was found about him, with which he said he would haft a knife. The governor being therefore informed of, he gave him his reward, and the lords and other present were convinced that a real body was in the great coffin, which some before had sculptured. In this quote, the great body refers to the huge coffin of Henry VIII, which was said to have been much larger than other two coffins within the burial vault. But by this account it claimed that a foot soldier broke into the burial vault of the infamous Tudor king, presumably unsuspecting because of his role as a foot soldier, and then inside of the vault, drilled a small hole into the coffin. This man then managed to get a bone of the king, and this was then removed out of the hole, and then he hoped to take this away to fashion himself a new knife handle using the bones of King Henry VIII. This was, despite the reputation of King Henry VIII being a tyrant, a direct act of corpse defilement and something which was a terrible crime. But it was not the first time this sort of behaviour happened, as throughout the centuries, even inside of Westminster Abbey, the heart of English Christian worship, the remains of a medieval queen, Catherine of Valois, were stolen, messed about with, and even kissed years after she had passed away. The bone which was taken from Henry VIII's coffin was returned rather quickly, but later investigation of the burial vault by Sir Henry Halford, who was accompanied by the Prince Regent, the future George IV, would notice how Henry VIII's coffin was badly beaten up. They actually peered through the holes in the coffin to see the remains of the six-wifed king, but they were moved to be more concerned about the coffin next to Henry's, and that was of King Charles I's. They even opened this and noticed that Charles's head had come apart from his body after it had been sewn on after death. But this was the last recorded time that Henry VIII's burial vault was opened. The story of the foot soldier who attempted to steal the bones of King Henry VIII is a dark one, and some of you watching may feel that the tyrant king deserved a fate much worse than this. But let's all remember that he was a king, and his life still captivates people to this day, 500 years on from the days that he ruled over England. Today, thousands of tourists visit St George's Chapel inside the walls of Windsor Castle, which is of course still a royal residence, and they walk on the floor of the choir, not knowing that the bones of England's most famous king are directly below their feet, and that his remains may still be exposed to the elements due to the damage of the coffin. It's a scary thought that I myself have walked across the remains of King Henry VIII inside of the chapel, and that inches under the floor his body still rests in the same burial vault, alongside his third wife and an executed king whose head is detached from his body. Thank you for watching, and to support, please subscribe to Her Remarkable History. Thank you.